Imagine this, a single phrase in an ancient dialect, freezing an entire restaurant, unlocking decades of buried family secrets. What if one forgotten word could shatter a billionaire's world? A waitress greeted a billionaire's Sicilian dad, her Sicilian dialect. Greeting had every guest frozen. What if a single phrase in an old language could unlock decades of buried heartache and bring a powerful family to their knees? But wait, here's where it gets even more gripping. A young waitress about to connect two worlds separated by oceans and time, only on emotion waves. On a quiet Tuesday evening at Nana's Kitchen, a small Italian restaurant tucked away in Brooklyn's Little Italy, something extraordinary was about to happen. The dining room buzzed with the usual chatter when the heavy oak door swung open, admitting a group of impeccably dressed men. At the center walked an elderly gentleman with silver hair and weathered hands, his eyes carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of stories. Behind him followed his son, a man whose tailored suit couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. The young waitress, Lucia, glanced up from her notepad and froze. Something about the old man's face, the way he held himself, stirred a memory she couldn't quite place. As she approached their table, her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Speaking words in the ancient dialect of her Sicilian homeland, words she hadn't heard in years, but somehow knew she needed to say, the restaurant had always been Lucia's sanctuary. At 34, she'd been working at Nana's Kitchen for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to New York to care for her aging grandmother. The warm brick walls lined with old photographs from Sicily made her feel connected to her roots. Even though she'd been born in America, her grandmother, Nonna Francesca, had filled her childhood with stories of the old country, teaching her phrases in the ancient Sicilian dialect that fewer and fewer people remembered. The gentleman who'd just entered carried himself with quiet dignity. But Lucia noticed how his son seemed uncomfortable, constantly checking his phone and glancing around as if he'd rather be anywhere else. The other men with them, clearly bodyguards or assistants, maintained a respectful distance while scanning the small restaurant with practiced eyes. "Table for 6, please," the younger man said curtly when Lucia approached. His voice carried the polished accent of someone who'd attended the finest schools, but there was something hollow in his tone. As she led them to the corner booth, Lucia couldn't stop stealing glances at the elderly man. He moved slowly, one hand occasionally touching his chest as if breathing wasn't as easy as it once was. His eyes, though kind, held a sadness that reminded her of her own grandmother during her final years. The look of someone carrying regrets too heavy for one lifetime. "Papa, you should sit facing the door," the son murmured in English. But the old man waved him off gently. "I'm fine, Anthony. Stop hovering," the father replied, his voice carrying a faint accent that made Lucia's heart skip. It was subtle, but unmistakably Sicilian. Anthony Marcelli was one of New York's most successful real estate developers, worth billions, according to the newspapers. But watching him with his father, Lucia saw only a son trying too hard to show love through control and protection. The distance between them was palpable. Anthony constantly on his phone, his father sitting quietly, occasionally reaching for water with hands that trembled slightly. When Lucia brought the menus, she noticed the old man studying the photographs on the nearby wall. They were pictures her grandmother had hung there, images of Sicilian villages, ancient churches, and families gathered around tables laden with food. "Those are beautiful photos," he said softly to Lucia. "Reminds me of home." "Where in Sicily?" Lucia asked gently, something in his voice stirring that same strange familiarity. "Corleo," he replied, then quickly looked down at his menu. A long time ago, the word hit Lucia like lightning. Corleo. The same village her grandmother had fled from as a young woman, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the weight of family secrets she'd never fully shared. And hold on, the real twist is coming. A dying woman's message delivered decades later, changing everything. Stay tuned on Emotion Waves. As the old man's eyes met hers, Lucia saw something that made her breath catch. The same deep brown eyes that stared back at her from her grandmother's old photographs. The same gentle slope of the nose. The same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. Her grandmother's dying words echoed in her memory. "If you ever meet a Marcelli from Corleo, you tell them Francesca Bonano remembers. Lucia's hands trembled as she walked back to the kitchen, her grandmother's final request weighing heavily on her mind. Francesca had passed away 6 months ago, taking most of her secrets with her. But in those final weeks, she'd spoken often of Sicily, of families torn apart by old feuds and misunderstandings that had echoed through generations. The Marcelli were good people, her grandmother had whispered during one of their last conversations. But pride and fear made enemies of friends. Sometimes the greatest courage is saying you're sorry. Now facing this elderly man who might be the last link to her grandmother's past, Lucia felt torn between honoring her grandmother's memory and the fear of opening old wounds. She watched through the kitchen door as Anthony continued to work on his phone while his father sat in contemplative silence, occasionally touching the gold cross that hung around his neck. When she returned to take their order, the atmosphere at the table had grown even more strained. Anthony was clearly frustrated with his father's slow responses, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. "Papa," the doctor said, "you need to eat more protein." "Order the salmon," Anthony insisted. "I can decide what to eat," the old man replied quietly. But there was hurt in his voice. "I've been making my own choices for 82 years. Lucia watched this painful dance between father and son, seeing in it the tragedy of love expressed through control rather than understanding. Anthony clearly cared deeply for his father, but his constant hovering seemed to make the old man withdraw further into himself. "I'll have the linguine with clam sauce," the father said to Lucia, his voice barely above a whisper. "It reminds me of my mother's cooking." Something in the way he said mother struck Lucia deeply. The longing, the regret. It was the same tone her grandmother used when speaking of family she'd left behind. As she wrote down the order, Lucia made a decision that would change everything. "Excuse me," she said softly in English, then switched to the ancient Sicilian dialect her grandmother had taught her, Sai. The effect was immediate and profound. The old man's face went completely white, his hand flying to his chest as his eyes filled with tears. Anthony looked up from his phone in alarm, and even the bodyguard shifted nervously, sensing something momentous had just occurred. "What did you just say?" the old man whispered, his voice breaking. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Other diners turned to look, sensing the electricity in the air but not understanding its source. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Lucia's own eyes filled with tears as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The words she'd spoken, "I remember a family who loved you very much," had clearly struck a chord deeper than she'd ever imagined possible. "My grandmother," she whispered. "Matwa was Francesca Bonano from Corleo. She told me to tell any Marcelli I met that she remembered." The silence that followed Lucia's revelation was deafening. The old man, Vincent Marcelli, began to sob openly, his weathered hands covering his face as decades of buried grief poured out. Anthony dropped his phone, staring in confusion and growing alarm at his father's breakdown. "Papa, what's wrong? Should I call the doctor?" Anthony reached for his father's shoulder, but Vincent gently pushed his hand away. "Francesca," Vincent whispered through his tears. "My sister Francesca, after all these years." He looked up at Lucia with wonder and pain intermingled in his eyes. "She's your grandmother." Lucia nodded, her own tears flowing freely now. "She passed away 6 months ago, but she never stopped talking about her family in Sicily. She never stopped missing home." Vincent's grief intensified, and the sound of his weeping filled the small restaurant. Other patrons watched with respectful concern, sensing they were witnessing something deeply personal and sacred. Anthony looked completely lost, unable to comprehend why his father was falling apart over a woman he'd never heard of. "I don't understand," Anthony said helplessly. "Papa, who is Francesca? Why didn't you ever tell me about her?" Vincent struggled to compose himself, accepting the napkin Lucia offered him. "She was my little sister, only 18 when she left Sicily. There was a misunderstanding with another family. My father thought she'd be safer in America. We were going to send for her once things settled down, but his voice broke again. Pride got in the way. Years passed, then more years. Eventually, we stopped trying to find her. The weight of decades of regret filled Vincent's voice. Lucia sat down across from him, no longer concerned about restaurant protocol. This was bigger than her job, bigger than anything she'd ever experienced. She tried to find you too, Lucia said gently. She hired investigators, wrote letters to Sicily. She never married because she said her heart belonged to her family back home. She waited her whole life for word that you were looking for her. Anthony stared at his father as if seeing him for the first time. You had a sister? All my life you never mentioned a sister. Vincent's shame was palpable. I thought she was dead when the letters stopped coming. When our contacts in America heard nothing, I convinced myself it was better to grieve her than to keep hoping. He turned to Lucia with desperate eyes. Did she? Was she happy? Did she have a good life? Lucia smiled through her tears, remembering her grandmother's warmth and strength. She was wonderful. She opened a small bakery, helped other Italian immigrants find their way. She never had children of her own, but she took care of everyone in the neighborhood. She called them all her familia. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments. Vincent nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. She always had the biggest heart in our family. Even as a child, she was taking care of stray cats and helping the neighbors. He paused, his breathing labored. I failed her. I failed my little sister. The moment hung heavy with the weight of a lifetime's worth of missed connections and love unexpressed. You didn't fail her, Lucia said firmly, her voice cutting through Vincent's self-recrimination. She understood. She always said that sometimes life pulls families apart, but love never dies. It just waits. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, the same one she carried everywhere since her grandmother's death. It showed a young woman with kind eyes standing in front of a small bakery, flour dusting her apron, her smile radiant despite the hardships she'd faced. Vincent took the photograph with shaking hands, studying every detail of his sister's face. She looks so much like our mother, he whispered. The same eyes, the same smile when she was helping others. Anthony leaned forward, seeing the photograph for the first time. She's beautiful, Papa. She looks like she had a good spirit. She did, Vincent said, his voice growing stronger. Francesca always believed in second chances, in forgiveness. He looked up at Lucia with sudden urgency. You said she left a message for any Marcelli she might find. Lucia nodded and reached into her other pocket, pulling out a small sealed envelope that had been yellowed with age. She made me promise to carry this with me always, just in case. She said someday God would bring the right person into my life. With trembling fingers, Vincent opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. As he read, his tears started anew. But these were different tears. Tears of healing rather than grief. After several minutes, he looked up at Anthony. She forgives us, he said simply. She forgives our family for letting pride and fear keep us apart. And his voice caught. She says she prayed every night that we were healthy and happy, and that she died knowing she would see us again in heaven. Anthony was openly crying now, understanding finally hitting him. All these years you carried this guilt alone. Papa, why didn't you tell me? Vincent reached for his son's hand. Because I was ashamed. Because I thought I could protect you from my failures by keeping them buried. He squeezed Anthony's fingers. But Francesca was right. Secrets don't protect anyone. They just build walls between the people who should love each other most. The two men embraced then. Truly embraced. For the first time in years, Anthony held his father close, whispering apologies for his impatience, his distance, his failure to see past his father's quiet exterior to the pain beneath. We have a chance now, Vincent said when they finally separated. Thanks to Lucia, to Francesca's love reaching across all these years, we have a chance to do better. Lucia wiped her eyes, overwhelmed by the beauty of what she was witnessing. Her grandmother's final gift wasn't just the healing of old family wounds. It was the opening of new possibilities for love and connection. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel Emotion Waves for more heartwarming tales. Vincent turned to Lucia with eyes full of gratitude. You've given me the greatest gift an old man could receive, the chance to honor my sister's memory and heal my relationship with my son. But now I want to give you something in return. Vincent reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, ornate locket that had clearly been worn close to his heart for many years. This belonged to our mother, he said, placing it gently in Lucia's hands. Francesca should have inherited it when Mama died, but she was already in America. I've carried it ever since, hoping someday I could give it to her. Lucia opened the locket to find a tiny photograph of a young woman who looked remarkably like her grandmother, surrounded by 4 children, including a little girl with bright, curious eyes that could only be Francesca. "Now it belongs to you," Vincent continued. "You're the bridge between our families, the one who brought love full circle." Anthony watched this exchange with new understanding, seeing his father's capacity for generosity and connection that had been hidden for so long. "Papa, there's something else we need to do," he said softly. "We need to visit grandmother's grave to tell her that Francesca lived a good life and never stopped loving us." Vincent nodded, his eyes bright with purpose for the first time in years. "Yes, and we should create a scholarship at the community college, the Francesca Bonano Scholarship for immigrants starting new lives in America." She would have loved that. Over the following weeks, Lucia found herself becoming part of the Marcelli family in ways she'd never expected. Vincent insisted on visiting the restaurant every Tuesday, their table becoming a place where he shared stories of Sicily and his childhood with Francesca. Anthony, transformed by understanding his father's hidden grief, began joining these dinners, putting away his phone to listen to family history he'd never known existed. The most beautiful moment came when they visited Francesca's grave together. Vincent knelt beside the headstone, placing fresh flowers and speaking in the Sicilian dialect, telling his sister about his son, about the grandchildren she would have adored, about the life he'd built but never fully enjoyed, because a piece of his heart had always remained with her. Anthony established the scholarship in record time, and on the day of the first award ceremony, he stood beside his father as they presented the check to a young Sicilian woman starting her nursing degree. "My aunt would have been so proud," Anthony said, his arm around Vincent's shoulders. As autumn arrived, Vincent's health began to decline, but his spirit remained bright. He spent his final weeks surrounded by love, Anthony reading to him, Lucia visiting with stories of her grandmother, the restaurant staff stopping by with homemade soup, and endless affection. When Vincent passed peacefully in his sleep, his funeral brought together 2 communities that had found each other through love's ability to transcend time and distance. The service was conducted in both English and Sicilian, honoring both the man he'd become and the boy who'd never stopped missing his sister. Lucia still works at Nana's kitchen, but now the walls hold new photographs. Pictures of Vincent and Francesca as children, family gatherings that bridge decades and continents, and the scholarship recipients who carry forward Francesca's legacy of helping others find their way home. Love never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to bloom again. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Emotion Waves for more heartwarming tales. Thank you for sharing this journey with us.